host, Monica Mathia, and again, thank you for joining us today. Today we're being joined by Tashayla Williams, author and therapist. Good morning and welcome, Tashayla.
Good morning, thank you for having me.
Tashayla wrote a book recently that was just released. The date it was released was
March 2nd.
March 2nd, thank you. And the name of the book?
It's called Lyrical Reflections of Childhood Trauma.
Very interesting. I'd like to start with just the definition of trauma because everyone has a preconceived idea of what that actually means.
Yeah.
And in researching to do this interview, I found some very interesting facts. So can you interview style, I just kind of going off the cuff, but can you define trauma for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of times when we think of trauma, we think of these horrific things, rape, abuse. It's any distressing situations that's distressing to you. So that could look different for each person. Some people experience trauma when someone they love leaves them. You know, there's an attachment trauma. There are two different types of trauma. There's acute, where there's one situation, and then there's chronic, where the trauma happens over and over again.
Wow. And this is also something I found interesting, and we discussed off camera. It could also be something moderate, but happens consistently over time.
Yes.
And then it has a trigger. So, for example, the example I gave you that I read about was someone who was always left home alone by the parent.
Right.
And the parent would always leave, but before the parent would leave, they would smoke marijuana. And so that became a trigger for that person. Every time they smell marijuana, they go into survival mode because they know that was the time in their life that they were left alone.
Thinking the person's going to leave.
Absolutely.
Actually, in the book, in the beginning, I give a scenario where I discuss a woman who experienced trauma, and she is triggered by the sound of water. And the sound of water triggers her to think about when her father tried to drown her mom because she didn't give him 3 pieces of chicken instead of 2. She gave him 2. So water. So it could be anything. So any situation that you deem distressing or you deem hurtful, it could be anything. It can be trauma.
And something we discussed off camera was the acceptable and unacceptable victims, because you also have an area of expertise dealing with sex offenders. You provide therapy for sex victims, sex crime victims. So from that perspective, one of the things we wanted to define and discuss was acceptable and unacceptable.
So when we think about trauma and we think about who's a victim, we often think about the people who have experienced abuse, either emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, and they're either our silent survivors or our advocates. A lot of times, and these are our acceptable survivors. A lot of times we don't think about our unacceptable survivors because they're shunned in society. We don't want to deal with them. You know, we just want them to get away. These are our offenders, our sex offenders, and our human traffickers. So also in the book, I give a scenario of a situation of a client that I was working with. She had experienced trauma, sexual trauma, several times, several instances where she was abused. And she asked me one day, have you ever worked with anyone who has sexually abused someone? And I told her I had extensive history in working with sex offenders in the prison and in the community. And that among these sex offenders, they did therapy and they were remorseful and were able to kind of process where they came from. So she didn't say anything during that conversation. However, the next session, we were talking and she randomly said, I don't want you to help them. And I didn't know what she was talking about. And then she reminded me of the conversation that we had, and she said, I don't understand. How can you help me and you're helping them? And I had to tell her, well, if I don't help them, how will it stop? If we don't help the unacceptable survivors, how will it stop? If we say we only want to help the victims who are advocates or the victims who are silent survivors, and we never address the offenders, the sex offenders, the human traffickers, it will keep going. So she, of course, She took some time to process that answer, but she understood that it was a need for both.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about your book. What was the motivation in developing the book?
So I actually, I'm doing a dissertation on rap lyrics and how it can assist with understanding anxiety. And so towards the end of my dissertation, I thought, it's not just anxiety, it's trauma, it's depression. And lyrics can tell you so much. And people connect with music. Music is a cliche, but music is a universal language. Even if we don't have the words to say, if an artist that we like sings a song and we can connect with it, then we feel like we're not alone in the world. So I felt it was important before I put out this research where people may or may not read it because it's going to be scholarly research, put out a book where I just lay it out there, really plain, really practical, to say this is how we connect with trauma, and this is the supports that we need, and these are the supports that are available.
Excellent. Now you're also a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any specialty or methodology in your therapy that you use with your clients right now?
Yes. Excuse me. I incorporate art and music, and again in the book you'll see I have situations where I will share how I use music to connect with clients to build rapport. There was a client who he literally had tried to bash his head with a rock, and they brought him to me 10 minutes later. So as you can imagine, stress was high, trauma was high. He didn't want to talk. So I told him, don't talk. Slid my laptop to him, and I told him to play a song. And he did. And so that's how we talked, through the music. I have other clients who are interested in art, so I do the same thing. Tell me how you feel today. Here's some paper. Here's some markers. Here's a paintbrush. We communicate in different ways, and we need to be supported in different ways.
Is your approach considered to be untraditional?
It is a non-traditional approach, although there is a lot of research that is backing the fact that it is something specifically for minority populations. It is something that is effective, but it is non-traditional.
That's interesting. You mentioned in the minority populations. Do you feel, as a clinician, do you feel that this particular group, in addressing therapeutic needs, is somewhat resistant? Is there a stigma behind the mindset with minorities and receiving therapeutic services?
Absolutely. I know when I first told my mom I was going to be a therapist, she told me, why don't you get a real job? She was like, we go to church.
Wow.
We don't go to therapy. But now she's my biggest supporter. And so every time I talk to her, she has someone who she's like, I need you to talk to this person. I need you to give them a referral to psychology today. Because now she's bought into it. Because she started to learn through my journey.
Mm-hmm.
So it absolutely is a stigma. It isn't something, but I feel like the stigma has come down a little bit, because in the media we're hearing mental health more. We're hearing anxiety more. We're hearing bipolar more. So it's not so taboo.
Very interesting. So the other thing is, do you find between male and female a difference in the way we react to trauma, or do you think there's a difference in gender?
There's definitely a difference, I think, because guys are socialized to believe that they can't cry, they can't share emotions. They have a little more difficulty processing it. I'll give another example from the book. There was a gentleman, he was 20 years old, and he came for anger therapy. However, he mentioned that he wet the bed until he was 10 years old. And so I stopped the assessment and I asked him if he had been sexually abused. And he started crying. He was like, how did you know? And I told him, I know because if you've been sexually abused, sometimes bedwetting is an indication of the trauma. It's an indication of you needing help, especially after a certain age. 5 or 6, that's typical, but 10 years old, it's not typical. And so that's an indicator that someone has been sexually abused. So just navigating through that and just educating people about what that looks like. But I have found that even initially when I started my practice, I was getting a lot of couples therapy. And so how it would start is the wife or the girlfriend would bring the husband or boyfriend. It would start off with, I'm not saying anything, I'm not talking at all, to, can you allow her to talk a little bit? Because they're looking for an opportunity to be in a safe environment where they can share that trauma, and a lot of times it doesn't come up for guys. So we just have to create those spaces so that they feel comfortable to say, I was a victim, and it still impacts me today.
And something I hadn't thought of until we had a discussion. We talked about also the introduction of sex for men.
Mm-hmm.
And people always assume that
Excuse me.
that molestation and interaction, rape for men is always a man on man. But we also talked about
Mm-hmm.
there could be an older woman and a younger man.
Absolutely.
There could be, a child who was introduced to sex by an adult woman.
Right.
And he's a male. And then this is his perception of women. This adds to his mindset about sex,
Right.
women, the roles of women, and it kind of plays out. And sometimes you see aggression or, something a little bit
Excuse me.
different in an exchange between a man and a woman.
Right.
As an adult, it carries over into their adulthood. So can you just elaborate a little bit, because people don't really
Yeah,
get
absolutely.
that.
There is, I would say, more cases than not. I've experienced guys who have been sexually abused by females. It's different for a guy because they're praised for it. It's like, oh, an older woman, wanted to have sex with you when they're a child.
Mm-hmm.
Just like the little girl will be a child. They're a child, so it doesn't matter if it's male or female. In those cases, I think it's harder for a male to say they've been victimized because they're supposed to like it. You're supposed to like it. You're not the victim.
Mm-hmm.
So it does make it harder, and it does transition into relationships, and not just for males, for women. Anytime anyone has experienced that type of trauma, it impacts how you react in relationships. I had a couple, it was a gay couple, and one of the gentlemen had been sexually abused, and he loved his partner. However, he would have these dreams that he was killing his partner or harming his partner, and he didn't understand why. And it was because he had experienced some trauma, he had experienced some abuse. So for him, that love that he was experiencing, I don't deserve this. This, he couldn't possibly love me this much, so I have to make sure I protect myself, because he didn't feel protected as a child.
And what about in an older woman, younger man situation? We talked about the young man feeling like he felt this is a woman. People always
Excuse me.
have an idea in their mind, women are supposed to be nurturing and,
So when you break that, yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
When you break that idea of being the nurturer, being the one you can depend on, being consistent, and now you're in a role where you're victimizing me, then that changed the whole trajectory of how I view life. It does, because you now look at women almost like you hate them.
Let's dive more into your book, because I can talk about this all day, because it's something that needs to be talked about, and people need to have a little more insight. And then for people, as you said, people, minorities who are not so open to therapy, I'm praying that and hoping that some of what you're saying, they will see themselves in it and possibly be a little more open to getting some help or support.
Yeah.
In your book, you said one of the foundations of your book is the lyrics that express trauma, and you talked about that a little bit. What do you want people to walk away with after reading your book?
I want people to understand that trauma comes at a variety of different levels, and that it is important for us to look at it as a global issue. Not an issue where it's just, oh, that's your issue, get over it, you're grown now. It's a global issue, and we need to be more supportive of our trauma survivors. And I want people to understand that we have tools that we can use to connect with people, to understand people. Music is one of those things, and that's what I talk about in the book, where, you know, even if you suspect, let's say you suspect your child has been traumatized, you know, there are specific songs that I would play in a therapy session and just say, well, tell me a little bit about how you feel about this song. From there, you make it very broad so that the person tells you either a personal experience or something they know, but it'll give you an idea of where that trauma goes for them or doesn't go for them. So music is a tool. So I guess I want people to take away that trauma is a universal issue and music is a tool.
Do you, in your experience, the group setting works in what you're providing?
So group setting works after individual.
Okay.
Only because there's a lot of things that you may not want to share with the group. You will need to build up to being able to share the things that you experience. Even though groups work with letting you know that you're not the only one, some of those things you need to process or do it simultaneously. If you're doing a group, also have an individual so that you're processing your individual situation before you expose it to a group.
The name of your organization, because you're an author, you're a therapist, and you also have an organization.
Excuse me, yes.
And the name of your organization is?
Life Embodied Therapy.
And how can people contact you?
You can contact me on Instagram at Life Embodied Therapy. That's LIFEEMBODIED Therapy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So one of the things, before we close this segment on your new book, how can someone obtain a copy of your book?
You can go on Amazon and you can type in Lyrical Reflections of Childhood Trauma. Or you can type in my name, Tashayla Williams, and it will come up.
Thank you. We really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And look forward to your book.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thanks.
Something we wanted to discuss, you also mentioned that you have a festival, Minorities in Mental Health.
Yes.
How did that start? When did it start?
It started last year in July. I wanted to provide a safe space for people to come and meet their therapist, see what resources are available in New York. I think a lot of times what people don't understand is that you can interview your therapist. Not all therapists is going to match with you. So I've had people say to me, I went to therapy, but I didn't like it. I didn't like the therapist. So I say to them, okay, did you interview them? Did you try someone else? And they're like, I didn't think to do that. You have to interview a therapist, see if you have a connection, and go from there. You can do as many consultations as you want to. You can call and you can say, can I have a 10-minute consultation? Just to get a feel of if you have a connection with that therapist before you even go to an appointment.
That's good information and good insight, because I think everyone have a perception that once you meet this therapist, like, oh well, you're stuck with this person.
Nope.
So now that's a good recommendation for someone to do a 10-minute consultation. And you said they can do as many to try and find a good match in terms of therapy.
And don't get discouraged, because not all therapists are created equal, unfortunately. Not all therapists are going to mesh well with you. There are some therapists that won't do the consultation. They'll tell you to come in, do the assessment. Don't get discouraged. They have to get paid. So even if you do an assessment with 3 or 4, it doesn't matter. You do it until you find a good fit for you.
That's also interesting. You can do as many assessments.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I don't think people know things like that. That's very important.
Yeah. Yeah, because if they
Okay.
see that you're not going to the same person, the insurance companies know. They don't tell you, but the insurance companies know that you may not stick with that therapist, so you go to someone else. Like with the doctor, if you don't have an HMO where you have to have a specific PCP, the therapist doesn't work for you, okay, you tried another one and you have to do an assessment with them because they have to get paid.
Okay. And you mentioned that there's a way for you to find a therapist on Facebook.
Yes.
Okay.
So Facebook has a group called Black Therapists Rock. All the time you'll see there are professionals on there, but you'll definitely see someone type and say, hey, I need a therapist for my 12-year-old son who's going through depression. And so you'll have like hundreds of therapists from all over flock at you to give you resources and information. You can also use Psychology Today, which is a great tool. And all of these sites make sure that you verify, like you have to send in your license, so you know that these are people who are verifiably someone who can support you. You can type in very specific things. If you want a therapist who, practice mindfulness. You want a therapist who does music therapy. You can put all of that in the filters, and it will give you a list of people who do that. There's also Good Therapy, and there's also NYC Well.
Very interesting. I actually participated, and I'm going to motivate everyone and encourage everyone to take advantage of the mental health first aid that's being given through New York City.
Excuse me.
New York City Department of Mental Health and Hygiene.
Yeah.
It was a great class, lots of information, good insight. I got a free certificate. So I encourage everyone, if you have an opportunity, take advantage of the free training. And did you have any other resources that you wanted to share?
I think pretty much, I think Psychology Today is my #1 source, because if you go there, guarantee you're gonna find. There's so many therapists on there, different cities, different states. You're gonna find who you need. But the other resources are great as well.
Okay. And you said something about Good Therapy?
Yes, it works the same way. Psychology Today is not as popular, but it works the same way in that they make sure that you have to send your license and certificates to confirm that you are a licensed therapist before you can be a part of their platform.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the Minorities in Mental Health Festival. Do you have a festival coming up?
Yes, the festival will be August 28th, 2020. Excuse me. At our last festival, what we did was we had resources from different places in the city, and we had panel discussions where our topics were religion versus mental health versus life coaching. The mental health versus life coaching was interesting because I found specifically with minorities, it's more comfortable to say, I'm talking to my life coach than I'm talking to my therapist. So just understanding what are the differences and how you can use them both as supports.
Wonderful. Do you have a way for people to get in contact with you if they want to become a vendor, if they want to participate on the panel?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, you can do the Instagram at Life Embodied Therapy, or you can email me at Tashayla, TASHAYLA 711@gmail.com.
Thank you for that information. Look forward to it.
Thank you.
One more thing.
Yes.
Miss Tashayla Williams has so many things under her umbrella. This wasn't your first book.
No.
You were an author before this book.
Yes.
What was the name of the book you had?
The name of the book was called Broke Entrepreneur. And the subtitle was Get Mentally, Emotionally, and Physically Prepared to Start a Business with Little to No Money. So, yeah.
So it focuses on becoming an entrepreneur. It gives them the tools and resources.
Yes.
And you also offer workshops on different topics and different areas. Can you give us an idea of some of the workshops you've had, so they know what you offer outside of your book and resources from your book?
Yes. From the Broke Entrepreneur, we have the Broke Entrepreneur series. where I provide workshops where I teach people how to start an LLC, how to start a nonprofit, how to write a grant, how to do your state taxes, how to do your property taxes. So it's walking you through the steps. A lot of the things going through the process I found on Google. It would have been nice to call someone and say, hey, you know, I found my taxes, but what is this property tax? I don't have any property. So I just, I wanted to create a space for people to come and talk about their entrepreneur endeavors and just have someone that they can bounce ideas off of so that we all flourish as entrepreneurs.
Wonderful. Do you also offer services as a consultant
I-
on different projects?
I haven't, but I'm open to it.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. Good to hear.
Yeah.
And they can also reach you if they needed you as a consultant on a project, or, you know, any assistance, grant writing, or if someone wanted to offer a workshop, how would they be able to reach you?
Definitely reach me in my email. I do freelance grant writing as well. Excuse me. So if you're interested in grant writing, I can send you those fees. And you can reach me in my email to shayla711@gmail.com.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One of the things we would like to add is some information that you provide, another book, in addition to the book that you have, Lyrical Reflections of Childhood Trauma. You also have a workbook. Can you give them a little information about the workbook?
Yes, the workbook is called 50 Lyrical Reflections of Childhood Trauma Activities for Adults. I wrote the workbook because I thought after reading the book it may stir up a lot of emotions and a lot of feelings, and I didn't want to leave the reader just stuck with that. So I wanted to give an opportunity for the reader to be able to process that trauma. So I created the workbook so that the person could either work through it as a self-help book or with their therapist. And that can be found on Amazon as well. And that's 50 Lyrical Reflections of Childhood Trauma Activities for Adults. Or you can type my name into Shayla Williams and it'll come up on the list.
Okay. As a, not just the author, but the therapist and the mind behind the whole process and project, would you recommend buying both books together?
Absolutely, especially if you identify yourself as a survivor, because there are some details of situations that are going to trigger some memories, that are going to trigger some feelings, and I want you to be able to process that. So I do recommend that you buy the workbook as well.
Very good. Buy both together. In closing, we want to thank Mr. Shayla Williams for bringing some insight and information about trauma.
Thank you for having me.
Again, at the end of this show, we'd like to give them the information one more time about your books and your workbook.
Of course. You can go on Amazon and you can type in Lyrical Reflections of Childhood Trauma for the book, and the workbook is 50 Lyrical Expressions of Childhood Trauma Activities for Adults, and also Broke Entrepreneur. If you can't remember all three of them, you can type my name in to Shayla Williams on Amazon and all the books will come up.
And they can also reach you
at Life Embodied Therapy on Instagram.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we look forward to the Mental Health and Minorities Festival.
Yes, August 28th.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
At the end of every show, I always close with a quote, and today the quote is from George Washington Carver. When you do the common things in life in an uncommon way, you will command the attention of the world. And again, that quote is from George Washington Carver. Thanks again. I am your host, Monica Mathalia, and we're closing at the InterConnections Network. Thanks again.